Alright, here's another one for the fellas, and this has been a long time coming. I hope by now y'all know me, my voice, and my motives well enough to listen in good faith. But if you only just discovered my channel because you rage-clicked when you saw the title or pounced in search of vindication, hi, welcome, and I hope you stick around. I'm gonna be really blunt with this one, because guys, fellas, my boys, I literally taught aerial acrobatics to children, and some of y'all trigger my safety mediation anxiety in ways that I have never experienced before. But I don't need to handle you with little kid gloves, because we're all grown-ass men. So let's act like it, because we are better than our combative reactions. If this discussion makes you feel threatened, I need you to challenge not the topic itself, but your defensiveness in response to it. Hello again, schoolmates, and dog bless you. We need to talk about female privilege. More specifically, how I discussed female privilege, because in my most recent video about messing up, I messed up. And I would love to say that that was part of the art, that it was all just a big setup getting us ready to practice what that video is about, but that would be a lie. I just made a mistake, and I would like to clear it up. So let's get right to it. I don't like how the female privilege section came across. Specifically, I don't like what the apparent message behind it seemed to be. You don't have to have seen that to watch this, but basically I took the position that female privilege does exist in certain circumstances, and there is a major problem with this. Well, there are a few major problems with this, but I'm going to try and explain it as simply as possible. That position was prompted by feedback I've received from guys who are struggling to understand their disadvantages as men. I empathize with that quite a bit because there are a few things that I miss about living as a woman, and I wanted to speak to that experience. But guys, individual privilege and structural privilege are two very different things, and I really need you to understand this. I especially need you to understand this if you're sitting there scoffing at me for being an idpol SJW soy boy. By your definition, I am an idpol SJW soy boy, and I don't particularly care, so unrustle your jimmies and hear me out. The colloquial use of privilege describes a certain advantage or benefit experienced by a specific person, an individual. So by this definition, yes, women have privilege. We all do. And I know some of you would love to just leave the conversation there because you have tried to do so with me many times. But there is more to it, and it is very important, because privilege in the systemic sense is describing something you don't have to deal with. It's an additional layer of bullshit that doesn't impact you simply because of your identity. Individual women can experience certain benefits over non-binary genders and men, but what is being described in the phrase male privilege is simply that you, as a man, do not have to also grapple with structural misogyny. That's it. It is an additional hurdle that you do not have to leap to partake in public life. To imply an equivalent female privilege says that there is some kind of male-specific systemic barrier that does not impact women, and this simply isn't true. But wait a second, what about men trying to access resources for survivors? What about men's mental health? What about male isolation? What about workplace mortality? Isn't that structural misandry? Doesn't that mean that women have some kind of privilege? If you feel that defensiveness bubbling up, relax your jaw, unclench your fists, and take a deep breath. Because the ills men face also come from that structural misogyny. That is the crux of the issue here. It is not a contest, and viewing it as one is part of the problem. The apparent benefits that women access, the ills that they are spared, are tied to the exact same structures that disadvantage them. There might sometimes be interpersonal advantages, but they are coming from structural disadvantages. Yes, those can exist at the same time. Let me explain. For example, women might not get stereotyped as dangerous and therefore not experience the same social isolation that many men do. But this no danger stereotyping comes from the very same construct that leads to women being violently victimized. This idea that they are resources to be possessed rather than human beings. They are not assigned enough agency to be viewed as dangerous in the first place. So there is a context-specific benefit, but the overarching system is quite the opposite of privilege. This objectification of women is where we get men being framed as predatory and women being framed as victims. And I can speak to experience on this one, because being viewed as dangerous absolutely sucks. It's heart-wrenching, and it's isolating, and it's painful. But being viewed as a victim is an immediate threat to your bodily autonomy and safety. It's hardly a benefit. Like, sure, people see you as more pro-social, but there's all kinds of awful things that go along with that. Everything from exhausting expectations of emotional labor to not having full ownership of your own body and having to guard against people trying to plunder the resource. To address a video more directly, the example I used was ill thought out and inaccurate, or at the very least, incomplete. That women experience the social benefit of more general emotional expression while men don't, but that simply isn't true. Because both men and women are policed for their emotions, and once again, this is done through the lens of misogyny. If you're a man who experiences pressure to repress your feelings, why is that? What phrases have you run up against that have encouraged you not to express your emotions? Pussy? Weakling? Perhaps more blatantly, literally being called a girl? Think about the contextual benefits that you have seen women experiencing, the ones that you wish you could have. What's stopping you from having them? Like, what is the barrier? And don't say that women don't want a man who behaves that way, because we both know it's bigger than that. Sure, some don't. Anyone can be guilty of reinforcing patriarchy. But where does it come from? What is the driving force behind that thinking? You can't do those things, because if you did, you would be behaving like a woman. This is systemic misogyny, my guy. It is the designation of womanhood as something to be ashamed of. The policing of male emotions is hinged on the patriarchal idea of emotions as womanly and womanhood as lesser. Women might be allowed to express a wider range of emotions, but only because it is an expected piece of their gender performance. Given this framing of womanhood, in expressing their feelings honestly, women run the risk of being regarded as less credible, less rational, and generally just less worthy of having their thoughts heard and taken seriously. Because of this, women too have to repress their feelings, just for different reasons. Expressing emotion is not seen as demoting them, because they're already demoted by patriarchal standards. Instead, it is seen as solidifying their place as lesser. What women are being rewarded for in expressing their feelings is validation of their subservience and irrationality. If women want to receive the basic decency afforded to men by default, they must guard their emotions or risk both interpersonal and structural disadvantages. For men, it follows from our actions. For women, it precedes theirs. Our privilege as men is not having to negate preconceptions before we are seen as individuals. Think of a woman expressing anger in a work scenario versus a man expressing anger in a work scenario. Who do you think is going to be taken more seriously? And if you're someone who struggles with these concepts, who would you take more seriously? And we can add to this the way women's feelings are essentialized to biology as a way to delegitimize them. That rather than being an understandable reaction to the things that happen, they are just a byproduct of hormones. Like men don't have hormones and women aren't three-dimensional human beings who react accordingly to things that happen. That example being used in my video was intended to acknowledge context-specific benefits for women, but I neglected some extremely important details. And the irony is that I acknowledged those details for men mere moments later, which is that certain social benefits are only granted if a man's identity intersects with other specific features, such as being white, able-bodied, cisgender, and thin, and only if he performs his manhood to the patriarchal standard. This is true. This very much stands. But the exact same thing is true for women. In order for women to be granted any tangible social benefits, their identities must also intersect with all of those other features that I listed, and they must perform their gender to the patriarchal standard. Their gender deemed inherently lesser within that standard. So for women who can and do access that freedom of emotional expression, it is not because of their womanhood. It is because of other features mediating the detriment of their womanhood. The very identity of female is framed as something to compensate for. So again, male privilege is simply saying that in addition to having to meet these limited criteria, men don't also have to confront direct misogyny that is applied to us at a glance. This is why female privilege is not a thing, and why you are met with exasperation if you try to argue that it is. If you are a guy who heard me describe the privilege qualifiers for men and went, "Fucking thank you," then you get it. You see the uphill battle. You recognize that there are systemic structures in place meant to hold you back. You understand that there are systemic forces at play, and women face all of the same things, plus misogyny. In the video that started this all off, I can understand why a lot of men felt offensive when I said that female privilege doesn't exist, and then went on to describe various social benefits I experienced when I was living as a woman. But as we've discussed, contextual benefits are not the same as systemic privilege. And here's where I need to ask you something really important, guys. Why does female privilege even need to exist for you to acknowledge the areas where men are hurt? What is that about? Why is it either or? From what I have gathered in talking to people who feel this way, a lot of guys see the male mechanisms at the basis of female oppression and assume that the opposite must be true. If men are responsible for the way women are hurt, then women must also be responsible for the way men are hurt. Right? I have talked about this before, but I will repeat it as many times as necessary. Patriarchy is not a synonym for men. The male-driven mechanisms that oppress women are the very same that oppress us. In order for either men or women to achieve power under patriarchy, they must perform their gender in highly specific ways. And those ways are male-coded. That is what is seen as success. The advantage that men have is by being immediately typed as not female from the jump. Patriarchal male success means being as not a woman as possible. Male oppression is an extension of female oppression. I know this is hard to acknowledge. I know it is challenging to confront the fact that people who share your identity could go either way as to whether they stand in solidarity with you or sit at the root of how you are harmed. It's almost like oppression is shitty, divisive, unjust, and irrational. Women do not experience female privilege, and they are not responsible for the structural ways that men are hurt. In fact, by dismantling patriarchy, we not only improve circumstances for women, we also open up a lot of gender expression and social opportunities for men. So if you are seeing the ways that you as a man are being hurt, the path to liberation is dismantling misogyny. Instead of trying to level the playing field and acting like it's a contest, maybe recognize that women tend to have a lot more experience when it comes to this fight, and you could learn from them. Nobody wins when we fight each other instead of the systems oppressing us. Alright, personal explanation time. I wanted to talk about this because the way I discussed female privilege in my last video was a big mistake on my part. Some of you may have seen the pinned comment already, but this needed a much more visible address. It's something that I take very seriously. It's something that I think is really important that people understand. So I wanted to get a video out there quickly, kind of acting as an addendum to that one. The silver lining is that we get to practice what the video was about otherwise, but one of the more minor things that's bothering me about that section is that I really don't want it to detract from the overall point. Upon playback and reflection, the female privilege bit really didn't sit right with me, and unsurprisingly, it was ACKNOWLEDGEMENT who talked to me directly and helped me realize all of the reasons why. They once again put their time and emotional labor into an exhausting topic, so this video was intended to share that work and make my stance a lot more clear. Leaving bad or poorly communicated content out there to just run amok is not good. It makes me feel really gross, and I like to acknowledge that there's a lot of responsibility that goes into making videos, especially given that the vibe of my channel is a place where we talk about things with honesty, accuracy, and compassion. This is not a topic that works as a hook or a stay tuned for, and that was very much my bad, because language really matters here, so a subject like this one is one that needs to be discussed in its entirety. That is especially true when you consider the fact that there are people out there actively trying to misconstrue subjects like this one. The framing here was intended to connect with people most in need of understanding the problem. I love my regular viewers, and I am very much openly a socially progressive leftist. I don't really keep that a secret. But I don't want to just reiterate things to people who already get it. I also want to be able to reach the people who might not understand yet. It's also why I used very binary language in discussing this particular problem, because men versus women is a very binary patriarchal construct. My fuck-up ran the risk of furthering misinformation in a specific population, so I wanted to address that population directly, because I know many of those guys do watch my videos, hence why I kind of had that segment in the first place. And if you're one of those guys who's still here and still listening, thank you for sticking around. Thank you for putting the time in, thank you for paying attention. I want you to feel welcome here. I want you to understand these things because it's beneficial to all of us when we all get it. One of the skills that I like to encourage here, that I really hope people take away from this content, is listening from a place of compassion with a genuine desire to understand, even when we feel challenged by the subject. So, to all of you, thank you for giving me the space to mess up and correct myself accordingly. And a very special thank you to ACKNOWLEDGEMENT for once again talking to me behind the scenes and generally just being an insightful, supportive friend. I will see you again soon, but in the meantime, try to remember that gender liberation is not a competition, and if you think it is a competition, try to ask yourself where that competitive framing is coming from. I'll give you a little hint.